Hey, Smarties. Hope you're off to a great Monday so far. We got a lot of news over the weekend and at the end of last week. So what I'm going to do is take a small slice of it, really focus on one of the big news items that I think probably has the most potential to impact your life, although many of them do. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. What we're going to focus on today is federal mandates for vaccines. However, some are not calling it a federal mandate. Some call it, the White House calls it a policy. And a question about whether or not these are mandates is really at the center of some of the legal debate over this. But before we get into any of that, I want to do a quick review that I think is missing from some of the news stories that may be helpful here in this story and others. And that is talking a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic and where we're at right now. So just a quick review. Back in March of 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic. They are the ones that make that designation. And what's really important to know about pandemic, we talked about it then, and we're going to talk about it now, is that a pandemic does not have to do with the severity of a disease. It has to do with how pervasive it is. That's how you get that title. If it's all over the world, if it's all over the place, it can be a pandemic. Now, let's talk a little bit about epidemic and endemic, two other words you might start hearing more about. An epidemic is something that can be like a sudden outbreak, like you could have an epidemic of the flu in New York, right? And the goal is to not have it spread, but you could have a sudden outbreak of an illness in a particular area. Normally it is somewhat contained, although it could still be a big area. But again, it's not a pandemic because it's not all over the place. An endemic, think about that word, endemic, inside, right? So like an endemic is often focused on a group of people or a particular region. When you look at that definition, commonly you'll see malaria as an example, right? Malaria is not all over the world. It's not a sudden outbreak normally. You can kind of predict where it is in a particular area, amongst a particular group, and somewhat predictable, although that can be tough for any disease, isn't it? So the reason why I'm mentioning the pandemic title is that what we've seen and why it really matters is we have seen the pandemic title being used to also talk about the severity of the illness that is at hand. And if you are in an emergency posture, the government can often do things that the government normally doesn't do. Like the government can tell you to stay home, and we all stay home because it's an emergency situation during a pandemic. The reason why we're going to take a look at what these federal requirements, policies, mandates, however you would like to describe them, is that they often set the tone for other policies, requirements, mandates that you could see at a more local level. So this is why it really matters. But the emergency stature that we've been in could be kind of an interesting legal part of this story. So where are we in the pandemic right now? Let me just show you what the CDC put out. This is their weekly tracker. This is when it comes to daily cases. So the far right hand is where we are at this time. Overall, if you take a closer look at the data when it comes to hospitalizations and infections and deaths, we're on the decline. I just want to pull your attention backwards to December, January, and February. That's where we saw that big rise. So I want to show you what some of the predictions look like for the months ahead. So I'm going to take this off the screen, and what I'm going to show you is something that we've used often from the University of Washington. This is one of the models. Let me go ahead. It's just kind of sitting on my lap here. This is the model that that's often referred to in a lot of different reports. And so this is actually daily death. So I'm looking at this in particular because I want to look at the severity of the pandemic right now. You can see this is January, February of last year. You had this higher rise. By the way, the purple line is what they believe is the total amount. The red line is the reported amount. And so they're trying to, what they say is smooth out the data with that purple line. So you can see it came way down here with deaths and we started to rise again. This is to be the Delta rise. And here we are in the decline when it comes to deaths. Here's the prediction. The prediction is here. This is what could happen in a worst case scenario. And this could be a better case scenario. This is what they say if more mass compliance happens. So this is what potentially what health officials are looking at as well. And so I want you to have an understanding of that, because if you start to see cases go up, you start to see deaths, hospitalizations start to go up and follow a pattern that we saw last year as we went through the holidays, then we might be in a different situation than we are right now, talking about some of these policies / requirements / mandates. So let's talk a little bit about what the federal government is putting forward. You got a couple things going on. You have the federal government saying that there is a vaccine requirement for federal workers. That's separate. Federal contractors that is a vaccine requirement. There is a concern about how many federal workers are actually going to fulfill that requirement, just like there was a concern about New York City workers when the city became one of the first places to require that as well. So these deadlines for some of these requirements have been moved to January, the beginning of January. And there's been a little bit of movement about what this means for federal contractors, and the government seemingly giving federal contractors a little bit more leeway to figure out how exactly they're going to put these requirements into place and what sort of exemptions they may provide. So that's one thing. The second requirement / policy / mandate has to do with companies bigger than 100 people. And that's been a big question about what that looks like, because the president announces in early September, but we didn't get any information. Now we have a little bit more information on what this looks like. January 4th is going to be the deadline for this. And what they're saying is that it's not necessarily a mandate. The argument is because you can also do weekly testing. So now we have some idea. The government put out a big kind of Cliff Notes version of what companies are going to have to do: either require the vaccine, get proof of vaccination, or allow for the weekly tests. So a couple things that I think you should know about this is that, number one, what the federal government does often sets precedent. But just remember this. You could be in a company of 75 people, and that private business says, I actually am going to require you to have the vaccine or do weekly testing. And there is legal precedent for private businesses to be able to do that, just like there's legal precedent for states to do that in school districts. So it's not all entirely wrapped up in the federal government, but because this involves a lot of people, potentially tens of millions of Americans with this vaccine requirement, it's something we haven't seen often, if at all, then it's getting a lot of attention. But just know that it's not all about the federal government. Private businesses can make some of these requirements. The other thing that's really important is that I just want you to remember that the testing option is in there. So it still is maintaining that if the vaccine requirement isn't what the company wants to do, then they can require you to hand in proof of a test. And that was a big question. Would the companies have to do the testing themselves? Would they be able to accept other, could I just go and do a test down at my Walgreens? Can I do my own at-home test? What will the companies have to do with that? It looks like there's a little flexibility there, but we'll wait even for more details on that. What I'm most curious about is about the legal challenges to this. There's already been 24 states that have come forward and said the government is crossing over what the government is able to do here. The government cannot constitutionally require these large companies to do that. And in fact, in our states, in some cases, we're saying that you can't make any vaccine requirements with this particular disease or this particular vaccine. So these legal challenges are going to continue. But I wanted to read this to you, kind of wrapping up full circle here, about that emergency status. Why do we look at where we are in the pandemic and how this relates to this? Remember, emergency status allows for a lot of different things. Emergency use authorization for a vaccine, for example, a stay-at-home order. And what the government is saying here, one of the government's lawyers, and I'm going to read it to you, the U.S. Department of Labor is confident in its legal authority to issue the emergency temporary standard on vaccination and testing. Emergency temporary standard. How temporary? Not sure. But emergency and temporary. Goes on to say that the government has the authority to act quickly in an emergency where the agency finds the workers are subjected to a grave danger and a new standard is necessary to protect them. So this is the government's argument. Will that hold up in court? Are we still in an emergency? That's a question. I can't answer that question. I just want to show you the statistics, and perhaps that changes. Whether or not we're in an emergency changes over the next several weeks, and how that will legally be looked at by judges, I think, is really key, and potentially key to other policies that you could see in your own area. Are we in a state of emergency still? What do you think about that? You get all these different statistics about vaccinations. Let's just talk about immunity overall. You have high rates of vaccinations in America for eligible adults. We now have an expansion for the option for kids under emergency use authorization. You have immunity in a lot of different forms. And the question is, where will we go from here? No one has a crystal ball. How the pandemic looks, the severity of the pandemic, could be a major factor in some of these legal cases, and that's why I wanted to flag that for you today. So the legal challenges are happening. They're going to continue. You're going to see a lot of different headlines on that. What is the end result? We don't know, but I wanted to kind of give you an idea of where we are in the pandemic and talk to you a little bit about that emergency status, because that emergency status is key. But there is flip sides. Remember, we don't have emergency status for chickenpox or the measles or mumps vaccinations that are often required by states for schools. They still can require that though. So how much that emergency status is a factor legally, I don't know, but I think it's a key part of this story because it's what the government is standing on. And, I think it's a big question for all of us as we go into the holidays. Are we still in emergency posture or are we somewhere different? All right, so we got a lot of different stories we'll continue to watch, infrastructure being one of them. You guys have a lot of different questions about what's happening with China. That's another big story I'm going to be looking at this week. What other stories you want us to look at, please let me know. I'll do a deeper dive on this requirement/policy/mandate as we see some of these legal challenges evolve a little bit and we get more of an idea of where this is going. It's hard. We don't know where anything's really going, right? We have to watch with some humility how the story will develop. So hope this is helpful for you today, at least looking at this story with a certain, framework and some curiosity. And I'll leave that to you. Are we still in an emergency? Do you feel that way? Let me know. Questions, comments, as always, welcome them, and more on all these stories on smartease.com. Have a great day, guys. I'll talk to you soon.